So today on the show, we are so fortunate to have Kathy Eckles with us of Essential Partners. So welcome, Kathy.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
So Kathy is an associate at Essential Partners and a project manager. She is a skilled facilitator, trainer, business person, and therapist. Kathy has built an effective ongoing community dialogue program that uses Essential Partners' approach and knows what it takes to build and sustain community dialogue projects. That sounds very impressive, Kathy.
Well, it's a great pleasure. And I live in Gloucester, Massachusetts, and that's really where we started our very first community dialogue and had so much success with it. We had the chance to work with a number of other communities around Massachusetts, as well as actually across the country. And Wallisley has been a huge pleasure to work with. You just have a great group of people who really love their community, who are really engaged, and some very great leaders, both as facilitators and also in your planning team. So having the richness of the skill of dialogue actually spread out through your community will really help you a great deal.
And you have a fascinating background. And so tell us a little bit about your training and your background in psychology, I believe. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. My first career was as an executive in the retail industry, and but there was always a calling to understand people, what inspires us to be our best, and communication. And then also sort of that deeper world about sort of the magic of life itself and how do those parts come together. And really the things about how we are as people, how we are with each other, and how we communicate and create together. That's the part that really interests me. Mm-hmm. And so so I went from business to psychology, and part of that is in private practice with people, and part of it is in working with essential partners. And because communication is so central to living as neighbors and friends and communities and leaders, it's to have really dialogue and have that resource available to us. It just feels central. It's being able to talk together, have space for each other, understand our life experiences and sort of what brings us to the perspective that we have, kind of our why underneath the what. This is a resource that works for everybody across ages, across situations, across timelines. It's just incredibly useful. So it's communication.
Right. And tell us about the company, about Essential Partners.
Yeah, Essential Partners was started about 30 years ago by a group of people who were family therapists. And it really came into being when there was the difficulty around abortion, and there was I believe a killing in Boston at one of our abortion clinics, and Laura Chasen, Dick Chasen, and some other colleagues that they were working closely with at that point really said, oh my gosh, we have this skill around how to resolve conflict in families. How can we take what we know about helping families work together effectively and bring that into a wider collective and help communities of people work together? And so that was really where it first began. And they really looked at what the principles were that actually help people relate better together. And, right now, Essential Partners works with, really for 30 years, they've worked in more than 30 countries in schools, nonprofits, communities, interfaith, religious areas, and really quite literally all across the country. And so it's, as well as through the world, it's breathtaking, the kind of difference that happens when people have a resource to lean on, to listen differently, and to be uh, interacting from a place of real curiosity.
Mhm. Right. And how many towns and areas in Massachusetts have you worked in or with
Oh gosh,
so far?
I don't think I actually know how to count them like that, but in the surrounding, you know, I don't want to say 12, 15 communities in the sort of this region, but it's also all the way across the country.
Mhm.
And it's in communities, it's in schools, it's in universities. Uh, and then here's an example, a really nice one is in Newburyport, so which this kind of our part of the world. They recently have done some really beautiful work around um, engaging schools and then libraries. They started reading a book, I think it was called Just Mercy together, and which led them to having dialogues to actually really understand what people's experience was, which took them over into the city government, said, oh, that's really interesting, we'd like to do X. And so it's a really good example of a very current local area where somebody was just really curious, and it just blossomed into the community.
Right.
um, so
Well, and so do you work with individuals as well as communities and corporations?
When you say individuals, we typically have an individual call us, but it's from a
Right.
larger community.
Community. Right.
When when it's working with an individual, that becomes kind of more of private uh,
Mhm.
a private setting. But Essential Partners is really about groups and community.
Right. And so what's something that you absolutely love about this work that you do that's perhaps different from what you did previously in your career?
Hmm. What I love is people have a real tool with which to communicate differently, and I think that's central to everything. When we can sit and talk with each other from a place that is curious versus judgmental, uh, everything changes. And because it's a resource that helps people share their life experience and the tensions of their perspectives, of really being able to share what they value, it it just makes a place where the fabric of lives weave together, and people find their own resources in their own ways then, from that place of connectedness about how they want to live together. And the other great thing is that the practices of dialogue, or what we would call dialogic practices, are applicable to all kinds of things. So one of them is we create equal time for people to share. People don't have to worry that there's going to be space for them, or that somebody else is going to take up all the time or conversation. There's a place where folks are invited to first think about what they want to share, and then sort of jot some notes for themselves, and then speak in a really sort of timed space of time, so that the field in which people are talking is really seeded really well by the group as a whole. And then there's a rich place for them to begin to ask questions, to understand more deeply what's true for the other.
Right. And do you find that overall, over the last year in particular, that civil discourse has had sort of suffered a breakdown, um, locally and nationally?
Well, I would say it suffered a breakdown. It's also enjoying a breakout, which would be like there's a lot of energy around people really wanting to talk about things that we haven't. So those two things, like breakdown and breakout, really, to me, look like they are just calling for a resource in which to have the conversations that we either have polarized against, or that we are really desperate to really have that conversation now. So, um, yeah, we're desperate for community. When you see the kind of work that people are doing now, uh, here's an example. In Maryland, uh, uh, five five interfaith communities came together and created this possibility for people to have a conversation in that region of the country around race and religious bias. They now have had conversations for several years and are involving 52 different faith communities, and they are conversations over time.
Mhm.
So that's the kind of thing that starts to build conversation.
Right.
People have conversations around even how do we learn. You think about the tremendous amount of work that's being done in schools right now, and um, when young people learn, like, a resource for communication, which we don't typically teach in schools, or we have not to this point, is now when they have a resource about how to, like, um, lean into how are they thinking about something. um, Schools can actually see the idea of having conversation early on in a young person's life, so that when we actually become adults and are developing communities together, we're more equipped to actually have the conversation from a curious place.
Mhm. Right. No, that's really interesting. What are some of the unexpected or sort of surprising takeaways or experiences you've had from your number of years doing this body of work?
Surprising takeaways. I want to say it's the heartwarming takeaways. I'm just really deeply touched by how much people care about each other and are willing to lean in to help each other, just given half a chance. That's the heartwarming spot. Um, One of a very simple but important conversation we had actually here locally was around homelessness. And in that case, what we did was we helped uh, the city leader, who that was her region, her ward of care, and we just helped equip her with having a conversation if people were homeless, and also people lived in the neighborhood of the homeless shelter. And a touching result of that, rather than whatever was polarizing them in the beginning, was they suddenly understood that everybody in the room that day actually shared the difficulty. I want to say, in that case, of at least knowing somebody in their family who struggled with addiction and what the challenges of that were. Um, so that was a heartwarming space. Recently, I worked with a university in Texas that uh, they were learning how to facilitate dialogues. They could have conversations with their faculty over the course of four different dialogues over this course of 2 weeks, to listen to what was true for the faculty, like what it's been like for them to teach through the pandemic, learn to teach on virtual platforms, in situations where their students were had very diverse challenges in their lives, and then pulling from that, like, what kind of best practices could they actually engage in. So there's a heartwarming space about what's it like for you, and there's another place about, like, given what we've discovered together, how can we live better, how can we
Mhm.
navigate this time differently.
Right.
We've helped, recently helped a church community that had in properties that they were trying to decide how it was that they wanted to use what they had, in a new way that actually matched what's going on in the community, and also not only in the community inside of the church but in the wider community. So that capacity to dive deep and stretch wide
Right.
is very deeply heartwarming.
Right. And keep things civil in the process.
Totally.
Right. Yeah. It's helpful when people don't get angry and shout over each other and they have a set of rules to follow,
Yeah,
guidelines.
yeah, and actually what's more heartwarming is that it's not only do they not shout at each other, it's like they get connected and care. And
Mhm.
that's the part that carries people over time for a long time.
Right. Have you ever been in a session where you were doing a training and you had to shut it down because the community was just too unruly?
Never,
Yeah.
never. It's there's a space inside of dialogue, and it's for intensity and for emotion and for difference. And it's placed in a way, it's shaped in a way that makes a place for it. And there's also a shared effort towards sharing what's really deeply true for you and listening deeply and intensely and maybe more widely than you have before, but to both share and to listen in a way that makes it possible for the other to speak what's so for them and also to be heard.
Right.
And that's kind of like that shared place of effort among people so that we have a chance for better relationships.
Right. And the package itself, the training materials, it seems extremely well sort of intuitively put together by a team of psychologists who can understand the inner workings of the human brain, where it's sort of easy to follow and things pop up at just the right time.
Imagine that.
Imagine that, right?
We've been at it for a long time. And so I'm glad to hear that that's the way it feels. And we find great pleasure in teaching people how to facilitate this work so that they actually can use it in their communities and situations in the way that works for them.
Right. And so and Kathy, how did you find your experience working with the Wellesley community in reference to other similar unnamed communities?
Oh,
We won't name others, but just in general.
everybody is different and wonderful in their own way. And when people care enough to actually lean into this work and learn it and share it in their community, what is not to love? I mean, that is number one.
Well, that is what we like to hear in Wellesley. So
Yes, but I have to tell you, your community is fabulous in the way of passion, diversity across sectors, which means you're very well resourced, and you have a planning team that is like focused. And you had a couple leaders, Lisa Only and Amy Frigoletti, were just dynamite, like sort of like point people for your planning team to be able to execute and invite people into really, one, learning how to facilitate dialogue, and then two is really inviting your whole community into getting acquainted with what this is about and what the hope is and the purpose of it for your community, and then also into the experience of dialogue. So um, you took on a big endeavor in terms of inviting 80 to 100 people into the conversation up front. And it was a great pleasure to be with you and to do this work with you in these last several months.
well, thank you so much, Kathy. It's been lovely talking with you. And please, if there's anything else you'd like to share or add, please do so. If there's anything else you want to think about to say.
Thank you. It's really been a pleasure, and we wish you every success in Wellesley. And you have the resources, and you have the spirit, and that will go a long way.
Perfect. Thank you so very much for partnering with the town.
It's our pleasure.